I believe that by overwhelming majority in all the Americas, you and I, in the long run, and if it be necessary, you and I will act together to protect, to defend, by every means at our command.
Welcome to the History in Motion podcast, where we discuss leaders, their decisions, and how they shape the world we live in today. In this episode of the History in Motion podcast, we set sail with Ferdinand Magellan, the visionary explorer whose daring attempt to circumnavigate the globe reshaped the map of the world. From navigating uncharted waters to discovering the crucial Strait of Magellan, his expedition was filled with triumph and tragedy. Join us as we dive deep into the incredible story of Magellan's voyage, its far-reaching impact on global trade, and the complex legacy of one of history's greatest explorers. This is the History in Motion podcast.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the History in Motion podcast, where we are continuing our journey into Portuguese exploration. And this time we are going from someone who was more of an explorer and then became more of a conqueror to someone who's really known for being, the ultimate explorer, and that's Magellan. And so Magellan is known for being the first person to do a circumnavigation of the entire globe, leaving from Europe, going west and coming all the way back around the other side and making his way back to Europe. But this story it's really fascinating. This isn't just, hey, he did it. There's betrayal, there's ambition, a little bit of backroom dealings, there's a little bit of stabbing in the back, and there's a little bit of, if we remember our episode on Cortez and how Malinche was kind of involved and how she was maybe pulling the strings. We have another character who we're going to talk about who may have had some of his own interests at heart outside of just making this journey. So it's going to be really fascinating today as we take Magellan and his journey from, becoming a great explorer to finding a way to actually go west and try to make his way all the way around the world. Again, there's no maps. There's no, hey, you got to go here, you got to go there. This is, hey, we know something happens down in South America. We know there's an ocean on the other side of the Americas. Other than that, all the power to you. And, you're taking a lot of big risks to go there. And, fortune favors the bold in a lot of cases. And we'll see how this turns into a very, very interesting journey for Magellan and for the entire crew.
I think that sentiment, of fortune favors the bold is probably so closely aligned with this era, the so-called age of exploration. This is really a period of very bold moves and bold risks to be able to, navigate to far off regions that have not been discovered yet by European powers. It's an incredible era, and it's one of such mystery and intrigue. And it does have this story-like fascination, for me at least, in terms of how boundless it is in terms of what they're trying to do. Just imagine trying to discover parts of the world that are unknown to you and what that does to your psyche. And just for your worldview and the knowledge that's kind of shared amongst these communities to understand now that the world is way bigger than we ever thought it was.
For sure. And I always read these stories and I'm like, why aren't Hollywood producers just making movies and TV shows of this kind of stuff all the time? Because all of these stories of exploration are just so fascinating with so many crazy things happening. And one of the things I always kind of like to describe them as is when you watch, say, like a sci-fi movie of going on to the unknown or going on to another planet, and you really don't know what's there. Yeah, you're on the same planet. You're going to run into humans. You're going to run into typical type of terrain. You understand oceans well enough. You know the stars. But at the end of the day, you really don't know what you're going to see. Like we talked about last time. They were worried about sea monsters, for example. They're worried about who knows what they're going to run into on land. In these far off distant places. And there's stories that, there's monsters and giants and all these sort of things in these places. And the psychological toll must have just been so huge for these people as they're making these journeys. They did it anyways because, gold and riches and the thrill of exploration is so key into what all of these explorers are looking to do. But this is a massive, massive thing for anybody to undertake. And like we said, it's just going off into the unknown and seeing what you can figure out and see if you can be successful. And not only yourself, but also your backers and the people paying for your voyage. Because, like we talked about last time, this stuff isn't cheap. It takes a lot of money. You need the king on your side to be able to do this. For someone like Magellan, he finds a way to to kind of kick that off. And we see that with a lot of other explorers as well, that they have the political savviness and they have the technique. And when you have those two things, you're going to get your voyage approved, and off you go.
And I think that just kind of underpins the dynamic nature of this era, right? Like this whole age of exploration roughly spans like 2 centuries from the 15th to the 17th. And it is one of the most transformative periods in human history. It's a time when the world, as at least Europeans knew it, began to expand very dramatically. The boundaries of the unknown are pushed further and further with each voyage. And I think, why is it worth even talking about this era? I think it's essential because it kind of lays the foundation for the modern world, and it sparks the first real wave of globalization. Yes, there is already like interconnectedness between regions, as we've already discussed and as we'll discuss today, but it does really shape this global geopolitical landscape and connects these continents together that have been isolated for millennia.
Yeah, absolutely. This is so much is happening, so much change is happening. And we talked about last week, there are certain milestones: getting to India, crossing the Cape of Good Hope, Columbus reaching to the Americas. All these little things are kickstarting. And now you're kind of getting this second wave of explorers who are going to start to push things into another level of, getting to certain areas and establishing colonies and actually looking for conquest, or just being so brave that, hey, guess what? We know how to get to India going east. What if we go west? Maybe we can get there the other way. And there's all these kind of things that are starting to come together. So, there's a lot that's changing, and it's happening so quickly. But yeah, it takes kind of this second crop of explorers to really push the envelope a little bit further, and then people will build on from there. So that's kind of, where Magellan and his world kind of starts off.
Yeah, I think that's so pertinent, because essentially what we're talking about is, Europe kind of being on this very profound cusp of change. So for centuries at this point in time, the known world is relatively small. You have these major trade routes running through the Mediterranean and overland across Asia. And I think we should underline overland. But these routes are long, they're dangerous, they're often controlled by competing empires, especially after the rise of the Ottoman Empire, which disrupts European access to Asian markets because of the Crusades and the religious conflicts between, Christendom and the Ottoman Empire. But you have goods like spices, silks, precious metals that are in very high demand in Europe, but they're increasingly difficult to obtain. Spices in particular, they're not just a luxury, but they're essential for, preserving food, medicine, and almost more importantly, they are a symbol of one's status. So by the late 1400s, you're also seeing European nation states that are starting to form. And you have Portugal and Spain that are coming on the scene, who are growing increasingly determined to find alternative routes to the riches of Asia. And these nations are, they're seeking to bypass those landlocked routes that are controlled by the Middle Eastern and Venetian merchants at the time. They want to have open and direct access to the treasures of the East. So there's obviously this economic motivation that drove explorers to, set sail into the unknown. Obviously, there's these promises of wealth, new territory, and prestige, but it's more than just economics, right? And we touched on this in the last episode. But these expeditions were also driven by religious mission. European monarchs and explorers wanted to spread Christianity to the new lands. They wanted to convert non-Christian peoples. This kind of aligned with the broader European religious mindset of the Reconquista. So there is this kind of, divine purpose almost mixed with this ambition for wealth and empire building, which kind of makes the Age of Exploration a very fierce, competitive, and high-stakes period in history. And furthermore, if you look at the political landscape of Europe, it also plays a huge role in shaping this era. And because of those nation states like Spain and Portugal, who are these emerging nations, they're also very hungry to expand their power and kind of just establish their dominance. This is why maritime exploration becomes such a powerful way for them to project their influence beyond Europe. And they're able to, potentially expand their dominance by tapping into those resources that would make them, much more wealthy and make them these powerful players on the global stage. And this is where guys like, Magellan and their missions are not just about discovery. They're about, survival, expansion, faith, and this kind of promise of almost like glory.
Yeah, it's a good old-fashioned arms race at the end of the day, right? Is finding who can find the better route, who can get there quicker, who can do it more efficiently. But then you're right, it's also coupled with this glory element, this ego element of I'm going to be the one. Magellan is the name they're going to write into history, or Vasco da Gama. These are the people that we're going to write into the history books alongside the king or the queen that, sponsored these voyages and really give power to that kingdom and to that nation. And it's so important, right? And, we see the Portuguese really focusing on that eastern part of the world, and especially into East Asia. And we ended with Vasco da Gama last week. The Portuguese are going around the Cape of Good Hope into Africa, and they're making their way way into India. But since then, they're even moving more east into areas like modern day Malaysia and Indonesia, and going to these really rich areas where spice trade is huge and so valuable. And so it's still a long journey. You got to go all the way around Africa, you got to come all the way up, and you got to make your way over. And there's a lot of hazards that come across that area. But the Portuguese own that. They're happy with it. And they're not really looking for any other alternatives. So we'll get into why that's important in a bit, but that's kind of the world that Portugal's in. Spanish are going west, looking at the Americas, and that conflict is going to start between the two nations a little bit around, yes, they have a treaty on draw the line down the middle of the earth. Spain gets what's west and the Portuguese get what's east. But at some point, okay, well, we're going east. Maybe if we go west, maybe that'll change things up. And they're starting to ask a little bit of questions around, maybe there's an easier way to get to India or to get to the East Indies. And, that was what Columbus was looking for. He was hoping for a way to, bypass what the Portuguese were doing. But, this is, once you've kind of have some of these established things, people are going to start looking for alternatives.
Yeah, 100%. I think that is just an economic reality of what they're trying to contend with, right? Portugal has an economic advantage that Spain really wants to challenge. And while Spain is expanding its own empire in the Americas, it's effectively cut off from the direct access to that very lucrative Asian spice market due to the treaty that was signed between them, which essentially divided the world between the two powers. So, Spain needs to find an alternative path to these spice islands, and it continues to fuel its interest in doing so. And this is where, Magellan's ambitious proposal kind of to find a westward route to the Indies really takes hold.
That's a perfect way to put it, right? Is they're looking for something new. They're looking for something flashy, because at the end of the day, if it's there, someone's going to find it. You want to be the first. And that's what the Portuguese did. They were the first to get around the Cape of Good Hope. They were the first to get to India from these European powers. And, that's kind of a big deal. It was kind of why they were able to be so successful in the 16th century. So if we look at Magellan, who he was, talk about Spain is looking for a westward route to India, into these spice fields. Magellan's a Portuguese man. He's born into an aristocratic Portuguese family. The story goes that he was orphaned at the age of 12 as a young boy, and he entered the royal court in Lisbon as a page. So kind of growing up in this kind of more higher class, affluent society. And he spent most of his childhood there and kind of grew up in that space. Definitely had the connections that one would need within the court to be successful as an explorer. And at this time, and we talked about it with Vasco da Gama, you're growing up in maritime exploration, the maritime industry. That's where the money is. That's the economy that's booming. Naturally, he finds his way in there by enlisting in the fleet of a Portuguese viceroy to the Indies, and spent several years learning the ropes, of how to be a explorer, to be working on ships, that kind of stuff. So he's going back and forth to Asia. He's going to Africa. He's doing a bunch of different things. So he was part of a invading force that saw Portugal secure control of one of the region's most important trading routes, and that's the area of Malacca, which is on the Malay Peninsula, and they did this in 1511. Malacca is part of modern day Malaysia, and then he also moved to the Moluccas Islands, which are known as the Spice Islands, which are in modern day Indonesia. So think of that whole archipelago. They're moving in and out there. They're going in, setting up trading colonies, and then actually physically conquering these places. And during that trip, Magellan actually purchases a Malay-speaking man, and his name is Enrique de Malacca, so Enrique of Malacca, to be his slave, interpreter, and companion. And he would remain with Magellan for most of his later voyages. So just say, keep that person in mind, because he's going to come back very soon. And that's kind of how he kind of kickstarts his career of, yes, he understands how to, he's been on these long journeys to get to these areas. He understands conquest. He understands how to deal with native communities. He understands kind of what it takes to do this. And so he's definitely established himself as someone who can do these sort of missions and isn't just some upstart who's looking for, I want to be a captain of a ship. He's definitely part of something that's bringing a lot of glory to Portugal and making the king very happy.
And I think in that same vein, right, like in our last episode and this episode, we keep talking about spices. And I think it's so interesting that so many of these conversations kind of are underpinned by this reality. And maybe it's important to get into like, why are spices so important, right? They're not just flavor enhancers. These are, you got to think about what era we're in. It's the 15th to the 17th century. They don't have modern refrigeration. These spices are essential for things like food preservation. They're also essential for medicine, and they're also used in cosmetic purposes for like makeup that's being created for the upper elite. So again, this is an era before refrigeration. Spices like cloves and nutmeg are essential for preserving meat and other perishable items. They're also believed to hold medicinal properties, and they're used for remedies and concoctions. And then again, there's this other reality that we often kind of overlook, which this is a status symbol at this point in time for the European elite. Being able to have access to these spices symbolizes wealth, sophistication, power. There is this kind of prestigious aura around it. But it's not just about taste or utility. It's all about economic dominance, because these spices are controlled by monopolies right now. That means if you're Portugal or Spain, you're at the beck of whatever these monopolies set at a price, and you're not going to get much leeway on any kind of bartering that you'd like to have. So the economic incentive, and a primary driver, which is like, I almost see the spice trade as kind of the engine of the age of exploration, because it's meant to, break up these monopolies held by these intermediary traders by accessing spices directly from the source to get these better deals and value propositions.
Yeah, it's kind of like gold in a sense, but it seems like since it's so local, you can find gold anywhere. It's got its value. It's not as practical as spice. Mm-hmm. But in this case, you're talking about all these different spices that are coming from specific areas, and you got different types of spices from different spots. And absolutely correct. Like the king of some place in some part of modern day Indonesia or Malaysia, he's got control over all of that. He's going to get ridiculously rich. Everybody wants it. And if you're the one person who can find that trade route or get there, you're going to be very, very wealthy. But you're right. Before this, you got to go through your steps if you want to get it, and you got to pay an exorbitant amount of money. And so, yeah, for Portugal and for Spain to be able to bring this stuff in, I can only imagine the types of wealth that they're able to bring in by just bringing in a couple ships full of these different spices. So with Magellan, though, he gets it. He knows spice is awesome. He is starting to become wealthy himself. He's starting to make a name for himself. So he returns to Lisbon, and he's, part of that group of, hey, we're going to do anything naval related. You're going to be probably involved in some capacity. And this is when the Portuguese coming out of Lisbon are going to war with the governor of Morocco. So the Moroccans are failing to pay their tribute to the Portuguese crown in 1513, and they are sent in as an expeditionary force to kind of put them back in line. So this is the Moors who were recently kicked out of Spain, kind of sitting in the Moroccan side of the Mediterranean. And this is actually where Magellan's wounded, and he actually had an injury that kind of created a limp for him going forward. But again, he's more established now in warfare as well. So he's not just a navigator, but he's been involved in battle, and he understands what needs to be done from that. So on top of that, he's known for being a ridiculously good student when it came to, studying maps and charts and all these sort of things, and just always wanted to explore. And he kind of hatches this plan. He's kind of looking, he's like, hey, I've been to these spice islands. We've gone east, and it's kind of a long way. Maybe if we go west, like we know for a fact there's another ocean on the other side of the Americas. Maybe there's a way that we can get to these spice islands quicker. And, he brings this up to many times to the Portuguese king, and the king's like, we're not doing that. Why would we even risk the fact of letting people know that there's a westward journey to get to these spice islands? We have the established trade route. It's ours. We know it exists. We control it. Why would we even risk it that there's another better way to go across it? And so he basically keeps telling him, look, this is not going to happen. We have this route. Basically go away. I don't want to hear about it anymore. And Magellan, being the ambitious person he is, says, that's great, but maybe someone else will be a little bit more interested in my proposition.
I think that's so interesting, right? You have this dynamic that exists between these two countries, and here's someone who's going to be very opportunistic to take advantage of it. And I think it's probably worth speaking a little bit about the rivalry a bit more. So, it does exist. There is this imperial rivalry between Spain and Portugal during this era. And it's pretty fierce, and it's pretty deeply rooted, and it all goes back to this competition for global dominance. Portugal has positioned itself as this preeminent maritime power by securing the eastern sea routes to the Indies. This is largely thanks to Vasco da Gama's voyage to India. The Portuguese control the highly profitable spice trade, which has flowed through the ports along the African coast and into Asia. Again, this gives Portugal economic advantage that Spain is eager to challenge, and Spain wants to expand its empire in the Americas. So it's effectively cut off from this direct access to these lucrative spice markets. And, King Charles I of Spain played a crucial role in funding and backing Magellan's expeditions, as we'll see, in terms of his ambition to compete with Portugal for control of this global trade that motivates him to support what's going to be this very daring plan of Magellan's.
If you think of the Spanish, right, they've got this Treaty of Tordesillas where they got the western side and the Portuguese got the eastern side. Really look at it, they really got the short end of the stick on that one because, yes, there's way more land out in the Americas that's conquer a lot easier than you could in the East. But the amount of money that you're going to make from the East is way more than you were going to make initially, at least in the Americas. The Spanish definitely, with a lot of the plantations and the slaves that they bring over, the gold mines and things that they set up, they do make a lot of money in the Americas. But right away, though, you can go over to the Spice Islands, load up your ship, and away you go. And you're going to do very, very well for yourself. Where the Americas, it's going to take more time. So absolutely, the Spanish are like, yeah, okay, we got the western side, but really like a chance to get at those spice markets because I think that's going to help us, drive a little bit of income for us, and we can use it to grow in the Americas and do whatever they need to do. And who doesn't want more money, right? So Magellan, he understands this. He knows this rivalry exists, and he makes his way to Sevilla in Spain, and he starts talking to different Spanish people and trying to figure out, hey, maybe is there a way I can get the king's ear? And so what he does is he moves there, marries a Portuguese exile. They actually have 2 children, and he starts to find his way to speaking to Charles I about a western route to the Spice Islands. And so Charles I is the grandson of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, who were the ones that commissioned Columbus to go west. So, definitely part of the family, this sponsoring of expeditions. And he's young and he wants to make a name for himself. And he realizes, of course, we got to find a better way to get to these Spice Islands because the Portuguese own this route. And so he says, all right, maybe there is a way. What if we bypass Africa and technically we're not breaking the treaty because we're going the other way? Which I always find funny how you draw one line down the middle of the earth and you say you get west and you get east, but I feel like you needed another line to say you get this side or that side. But anyways, that is basically how they get it set up. So Magellan convinces the king and he says, yep, we can do this. And the Spanish have already confirmed that there's an ocean on the other side of the New World. So they're like, it's possible. We might be able to do this. So Magellan is given 5 vessels with 270 crew, and these 5 ships are named the Trinidad, which was Magellan's ship, the Santiago, the San Antonio, the Concepcion, and the Victoria are the 5. But the most important thing to remember here before he sets off, he's Portuguese. He has Enrique, his Malay slave, translator, possibly friend, and you have a big Spanish crew, and you have some Portuguese people in there. You actually have, I think there's an Italian on board. It's very multinational. So, hey, they're European, but again, Spanish, Portuguese, already not too friendly with each other. Now you have this kind of mixed bag of a crew. It's not going to go over so well, but it's important to remember that, hey, he's ready to set off. He's got 5 ships, 270 men, Portuguese commander, flying the Spanish flag. Let's see what happens.
I think that's such an interesting reality, right? So I think so far in this conversation, even thinking back to Vasco, there's almost this I don't think it's intentional, but this coupling of nationalism and exploration, right? We kind of tie them together. We're sailing exploration in the name of, whatever flag you're exploring on behalf of. But I think this is an interesting example where it kind of showcases that nationalistic sentiment when, compared to that sense of personal achievement and identity is a bit more fluid than we would think. If you look at Magellan, he's Portuguese born. He served in his homeland loyally, but now he sees an opportunity to expand his own personal ambitions and interests, but it's not going to be with the country that he was born into. It's not his birthright. He's going to go to their competitor because he's motivated by something deeper than just, nationalistic sentiment. There is this kind of deep personal quest for recognition and achievement that is probably motivating him at this time.
I still go back to, as you were speaking there, just kept jumping into my mind was they're all armed entrepreneurs in this stretch of the imagination. So not my term. There was a historian who studied Cortez and the conquistadors, and he called them armed entrepreneurs because at the end of the day, these guys are out for themselves. They want to make money. They want to gain status. They want to get rich. What do they care what they do or how they do it? And you give a bunch of them guns and weapons. We know how that all ends for a lot of, indigenous groups and for other people who kind of get in their way. But yeah, for someone like Magellan, what does he care? He's ambitious. He wants to see what he can do. And yeah, if he has to change teams, for lack of a better term, he's going to do so. So he leaves in September 1519, and right away, Manuel I of Portugal gets wind that this expedition is happening. So he very quickly brings together a naval detachment of Portuguese ships with basically one job: find Magellan and stop him, because he's worried that what if this Western Passage does exist? We're going to be in big trouble. And so this is already causing some issues for Magellan. As they leave Spain, they stop in the Canary Islands to refuel and resupply. And usually this is something you can take your time, get what you need. But he knows that he's on the clock, because if he lingers too much, the Portuguese are going to catch up to him and he's going to run into a lot of problems. And that's kind of a theme of this whole journey, is we got to avoid the Portuguese, because if they spot us, we're going to get arrested, we're going to get killed, or we're going to have to fight a naval battle. And that's the last thing they want to do when you're trying to cross the entire globe. So, they set out, and like we mentioned, the crew is a little iffy with him. He's a Portuguese man. There's a lot of Spanish sailors. They don't trust the Portuguese. It's going to start to see that people are starting to not trust him. He's already getting word that there's some mutiny talk, and one of the commanders of one of the ships is like, we're going to wait a little bit. Once we get out to sea, we're going to take care of Magellan, and us Spaniards will finish this journey. So things he's got to worry about. But again, he can't stop and deal with this because the Portuguese are right on his heels. So these are all things that he starts to have to think about. So he continues to move along, and they're in the Atlantic. They're hit by a storm, which caused a delay and some food rationing. And one of the captains of this ship, the San Antonio, was actually appointed because he had really good connections. And, he was kind of green in the business of exploration, not the most experienced, but he kind of had this ego about him of, he probably came from a more aristocratic family and, didn't really have to pay his dues to get in the position. So there's definitely a sense of entitlement. Begins to openly criticize Magellan's competence, refusing to salute him and just really fighting back against him. And, a bit of a fight takes place between the different ships, and Magellan actually has this man arrested, relieved of his command, and imprisoned in the brig of the Victoria until they reach South America. So you can already start to see they're not far onto this journey, and people are starting to, we talked about armed entrepreneurs. Magellan's definitely one of them, but you got other people within his crew are saying, well, why can't I be in charge? Why can't I be the one that's going to get the glory? And people are starting to think a little bit here of, this guy's not one of us. Maybe we should take him out. Personal ambitions, whatever that might be. So let alone he has the most difficult navigation that's ever been done by a single human ever coming up. He's got to deal with a lot of internal struggles, to boot on top of all of these other things.
Just goes to the contentious nature of what's going on, right? And I think just to compound that, it's not like this journey is any easier without the rivalry or tension that he's already dealing with just on the boat itself. The reality is that he's facing challenges of such a magnitude that this is just one more thing that he has to contend with that he shouldn't have to contend with. Because think about the logistical challenges of what he's trying to do. They're using, celestial navigation to cross uncharted waters. They're dealing with things like scurvy that they're going to deal with or contend with. Unpredictable weather is obviously a constant danger at this time. Crossing an open ocean, during what could potentially be an extremely violent storm around treacherous areas could be, disastrous to this type of expedition. And then you get the human perspective, right? Fear of the unknown. These guys aren't seeing land for weeks, months at a time. The thing it's going to do to your psychology, at that point. And then on top of all of that, there's this seed of mistrust and lack of loyalty to Magellan, who is leading this voyage, right? And then there's just a lot of divisiveness already that he has to deal with amongst his crewmates.
It's not easy because what we're getting at here, right? This is very, very difficult. And I think you're right, though. It's the human element that might be the most dangerous to him, let alone the storms and all these sort of things. And even things I was reading too about, they'd get into a storm. You can't see 5 feet in front of you. The storm clears and you're by yourself. You can't see another one of your ships. So they always had plans of, hey, if we get separated, come back here. But could you imagine the panic for Magellan? They get out of a storm and he can't find one of his ships. And he's dealing with these issues of, do they decide to go somewhere else? Did they leave? Do I wait for them? What's happened here? What do I do in these situations? So there's all these things I'm sure that are going through his head, but he manages to keep the crew together at this point. He's got issues. And I think with any captain, right, you have to be brutal when you need to be. You need to set an example. You can't give an inch because they're going to take a yard when it comes to this sort of stuff. So, and then you also just can't be brutal and just start, executing people. Again, you only have 270 crew, and we know from all of our previous episodes on these types of voyages, scurvy, illness, dehydration, people are going to start dying and you're going to need the manpower, so you can't really spare it. It's a bit of a challenge, especially when there's no friendly stop off point either that you're going to find your way to, and you can collect more men and that kind of stuff. So it's going to get a little tricky. the farther away they get from Spain. So eventually they cross the Atlantic in December. So it's about 3 months it takes them, and they reach South America and they make landfall in Rio de Janeiro. So for 2 weeks, they're interacting with indigenous people. They're trading trinkets for food, basically doing what sailors would do, place where they're stopping off. Now they're starting to scour the coastline for an opening. They're really just trying to find where they need to go next. So you have to remember at this point, they're assuming they can get to the Pacific Ocean from around South America. They really don't know if that even exists. There could be, this could take them all the way down to Antarctica. There could be a mountain range in the way. They really don't know. And so you have to think of them going down this coast and they see an inlet, they explore it. Oh, okay, that's nothing. Let's come back out. Oh, we go down here. That's nothing. And so they keep trying to go south and south and south until eventually they find the Rio de la Plata, which is this elusive passage of kind of islands and small kind of inlets that's at the base of South America. And the conditions there are really difficult because remember, this is December at the southern tip of South America. So, these are areas that are known for having penguins and really cold temperatures. So these guys are not used to cold weather. These are guys typically dealing with heat as they're going, around Africa, India, Malaysia, Indonesia. And so they're going to really cold temperatures. It's freezing conditions and it's really, really difficult for them. So they end up stopping in Port St. Julian in Patagonia. And so Patagonia is an area that's in the south of Argentina. And one of the things is about why it was named Patagonia. So there was these rumors before about there being very large people there, like giants. Like there's stories of 17-foot humans that are just walking around. And so it was recorded that he called the people Patagoa. This is Magellan, and it's Patagoni, which is kind of the Italian version of the pluralized version, which comes from his person on the ship that was kind of taking account of everything. He was Italian, so we called it Patagoni. And so he never really elaborated on why he used that word, but it basically kind of means very tall people, big people, giants. And so Magellan's crew had claimed they'd saw, really tall statues as they were kind of moving around Patagonia. And so this kind of story starts to grow of, this huge people are there. And so the name kind of sticks. And I think it's really interesting because it's always nice to understand why things are named what they are. And it's something as simple as Magellan's stenographer, I guess, is writing down, hey, he's used this word and I'm Italian, so I'm going to call it Patagoni, and changed into Spanish, and Patagonia is the name that sticks. And it really is like the land of the giants, which is just so fascinating about, an area that we all know today. It was named just for kind of a bit of folklore around why it was named that, which I think is kind of cool.
I was doing a quick search while you were speaking because I thought that was interesting. So apparently it can be drawn back to a term used to describe the large footprints of the indigenous people that inhabited it while Magellan was there.
Yeah. And I always wonder, like, was there just a bunch of tall guys that got together and that's all they saw? And they were like 6'2" back then, and everyone else is like 5 foot nothing. And they're like, they're huge. They're massive people. It's always interesting to see, or, did they mistake it for something else? But, this is the part of the journey that makes it so interesting, is they don't know what they're going to find. So they're going to make up stories to kind of explain things. They're going to get scared. They're going to get excited. They're going to write things down of, we think we saw giants, but we're moving on, right? We're doing the next thing. So this is just kind of what's going to be par for the course for the rest of this journey. So as they're moving through this area, you have to remember it's a lot of inlets and big rivers, and, it's not, a straight shot through. So they don't really know where they're going. They're separating out, trying to find different ways through. Someone coming back going, no, that's a dead end. That's a dead end. Or the river gets too narrow here. We have to go back. And so they eventually find their way through. But some of these Spanish captains are starting to realize this is a perfect time for us to escape and do our own thing, because Magellan's not going to see technically what we're doing. We're kind of all doing our own thing. And so several captains actually go on to a full-blown mutiny while they're in this region. And this is where Magellan has a very swift but brutal response. He basically gets into a full-on battle with his supposedly allied ships. They're able to win that. There's more people loyal to Magellan. He executes one of the ringleaders. He maroons, which basically means leaving one of the other ringleaders behind. And he was originally going to execute 30 men who were involved in this. After some time, he decides to spare them, but gives them, the most tough assignments on the ship, really hard labor, and kind of gets them back in order. And it's a good thing he does it, because he's going to need the manpower for what's coming up. But again, this is another sign that, Magellan is in one of his most critical moments. He needs to have as many people on his side. And this is where he finally finds his way through the southern tip of South America and his way into the Pacific Ocean. And that's what we call today as the Straits of Magellan. So again, why is it named for that? This one's a little bit more simple, but he finds what he's looking for. He's crossed South America and now he's into a new ocean. And all he's got to do is cross that little thing and he'll make his way to the spice fields and, he'll accomplish his goal. So he thinks.
I think it's such an important story or chapter of this expedition, right? Like, to me, it reads it's almost one of his most pivotal and dramatic events that he's going to have to contend with. And based on what you're saying, he acts pretty swiftly and decisively and is able to gain back control. But then if you kind of flip the script and you take it from, if you try to put yourself in the shoes of the people that are actually doing the mutiny, think about the harsh conditions that they're dealing with. This cold and brutal winter in Patagonia. They're enduring months of isolation, food scarcity. Again, we go back to this idea of like the discontent amongst the Spanish captains who feel that, Magellan's Portuguese. What's he even doing? Can we even trust this guy? So there's that element of jealousy there. And maybe even this creeping sense of doubt about the route. They've been at sea for several months. At this point, they haven't technically discovered the Strait of Magellan yet, right? So maybe they'd lost faith in the mission and feared that the route to the Spice Islands through the west was a myth. It's not going to happen. I don't know what we're doing here. So, you have these three kind of factors compounding, and then ultimately you have this very decisive event that's going to unfold for Magellan, and he deals with it in, it seems like in a harsh but precise and disciplined way.
Absolutely. And that's typical, I think, for any naval captain at that point, is you have to be brutal, because this is kind of like a Lord of the Flies situation, right? You're in a confined space. It's just you and the man next to you, and you got to keep order. You got to keep rank. Because as soon as there's any chaos, it turns into, all out Armageddon. So he has to contend with that. And as he's continuing to move through the Straits of Magellan, they enter an area that's known today as Tierra del Fuego, which means the land of fire. And again, this was named by Magellan's crew because as they were passing through, they saw so many fires lit by the human settlements of the indigenous groups that were in there, which I'm sure was terrifying. And so they just named it the Land of Fire, which I think is kind of cool. So getting a lot of that area, all the naming, you can definitely thank to, Magellan. And I kind of like that Tierra del Fuego. It sounds way better in Spanish than it does in English, but Land of the Fires is still pretty cool. So he's, finally ready to pick up a strong current. The tides are looking well. He's heading west, but he's still got problems. He loses a ship that eventually breaks down too far enough that it's not able to continue. And one of his ships actually escapes. And so I remember I mentioned before that some of these captains were talking about, hey, this is actually a good area that we can slip away because it's a little bit more difficult to navigate. And if we can find a good spot, we can slip away. And one of them left and went back to Spain. And this captain was punished severely for doing so. But again, they don't have faith. And like you said, maybe this route doesn't even exist. Can we even make it? But eventually they do. And they make it through. So he's got his 3 ships remaining. They enter what they call the Mar Pacificum, which basically means the peaceful sea. So they get into the Pacific and they're like, oh, this is so nice. Nice blue water, nice sunshine. Everything's nice and calm. This is going to be great. We're going to have no problems here. We'll be in the Spice Islands in no time. And the reason they think that is they don't know how big the Earth is. There's a massive miscalculation that was made. And you can thank the Greeks for this. So 14 centuries earlier, there's a Greek geographer, and he basically, looking at some different calculations, determined that what the size of the Earth was. But he was off by about 15%. He underestimated how big the Pacific Ocean was. Based on everything they knew up to that point, they assumed that the Pacific Ocean was tiny. And it's not just tiny. 15% of the Earth is a lot. So Magellan calculated, once we get to the Pacific Ocean, 4 days, 5 days, we'll be in Malacca in no time. This will be no problem. So they're planning for this. They're planning for a 5-day voyage, maybe a little bit longer, just as contingency. It's going to take them 4 months to cross the Pacific Ocean, and they're going to go about 10,000 kilometers more than they expected. So, this is a massive miscalculation, literally, by everybody involved. And you can't really blame Magellan. He's got the calculations. He's making the preparations. But again, this is the part of the journey of sailing into the unknown. And they're literally sailing into an ocean that's unbelievably massive, nothing like they've ever seen before. And they're going to deal with heat, scurvy, dehydration, and every awful thing you can imagine of being, out at sea for months without ever seeing land.
Could you imagine? So obviously, we've discussed how Magellan is like a student of maritime navigation. He's very well studied. this is something that he's been passionate about for a very long time. He's got to know these calculations inside and out if he's planned this voyage. Could you imagine that moment when he realizes how off that calculation was and what that does to his understanding of everything that's preceded that moment about the size of the world? And I think that's so cool about this. Like 4 months is huge. That is massive. We're talking about the level of hardship that they're probably dealing with as a crew is, hard to even imagine at that point. But what it does for his understanding, the level of knowledge that he's had up to this point and what it means for the rest of the world, it's a pretty incredible realization, or a pretty incredible miscalculation, I imagine, when it actually dawns on him how off the calculation actually was.
I almost like to think, like, do you ever probably came to their mind of maybe the world actually is flat? Maybe we really messed up because maybe this ocean just goes on forever and we fall off the edge of the earth because this just keeps going and going and going and going. But again, they keep going because you got to think too, they don't know how big this thing is. So they keep going. Mm-hmm. Should we turn back? Oh no, it's probably, we can just keep going. We can keep going. And the thing is, they kind of are really unlucky because they don't really hit any of those small islands off the coast of South America. Like, they don't run into Hawaii. They don't run into Easter Island or any of these little small islands. It's just nothing. They're going over ocean and ocean and ocean. And there's a gentleman on, and we've mentioned him a few times, his name's Pigafetta, which is he was an Italian on there who was essentially their record keeper and kind of writing the story as they went along. And he basically talks about, these 3-4 months at sea were just so brutal and horrific. Scurvy is so bad that one of the things that happens is your gums get really inflamed, and you start to look at people. They couldn't even chew food because their gums were so inflamed from all the scurvy. He accounts that they ate biscuits, which were no longer biscuits. So basically like powder at this point. They're swarming with worms, this powder. They had, the whole place stank strongly of the urine of rats. So they're starting to eat rats. There's yellow water that they just, their water's kind of gone bad and they're just having to drink it because they have no other choice. They have these ox hides that they were using to kind of protect parts of the ship. They started eating that. And it's essentially pure desperation at this point. There's no accounts of them resorting to cannibalism or anything like that. But, with people dropping dead, I'm sure it was thought about or maybe even did happen. But, they managed to make it through, which is incredible. They somehow managed, there's thousands of islands in the Pacific and they miss most of them. So they finally get to Micronesia and they land in Guam. And here we're told the locals travel out to meet with them and trade with the travelers. But again, for Magellan and the crew, like it just gets worse here. They invite the indigenous people onto their ship. They're like, hey, nice to meet you and everything. And as soon as they get a chance, the indigenous people rob them blind and steal a bunch of stuff off the ships. And so I will have to say Magellan and his crew are really great at naming things. They called the people of Guam, the name they named, instead of calling it Guam, they just called it the Island of Thieves. So nice and simple. But I think it kind of goes with the theme of they're very blunt with their naming conventions of these islands and these territories that they go through. So as they continue to move west, like they realize their civilization. I'm sure they're starting to figure out where they are. They're able to resupply a little bit, and they've reached the Philippines. And this is huge, right? Because they know the Philippines exists. They know where they are for the most part, and they finally run into some locals, and it doesn't go well. It's leading into a little bit of local conflict, and this is where Magellan, I think, has a little bit of a weak spot. Clearly a brilliant navigator, clearly a brilliant leader of men on the open seas, but his judgment as a diplomat and a warrior is what is going to cause him some challenges here. So he allies himself with a local chieftain, and he actually found himself drawn into a battle with one of these chieftains. And basically what happened was he was able to convert one of these chiefs and his group to Christianity, which was awesome. But this chief had an issue with another chief and basically said, hey, look, why don't you go over there and kick their butt and convert them to Christianity? And again, this is classic imperialism, right? New guys show up, the locals are playing them off each other. And so for whatever reason, Magellan, again, he's armed pretty well. He's got a decent crew. So he takes about 60 very heavily armed Europeans, accompanied with a lot of Filipinos, to another island. And the group is called the Lapu-Lapu, and they refuse to recognize the authority of this other group or of the Spanish, and basically were ready for war. And Magellan's whole thing, and this is similar to how Cortez and a lot of the Spanish would do things, was we're going to do a shock and awe campaign. We're going to fire the cannons. We're going to show that we're super powerful. We got guns, crossbows, swords. We're technologically superior. They're going to get scared and run away. So he shows up, and the opponents have 1,500 warriors. And so Magellan continues forward. He thinks, hey, we'll shoot the cannons a few times. They'll run off. But that's not what happens. He actually instructs his Filipino allies to hang back, and he actually goes to the the shore with only 49 men. So they come in, they start torching houses. They're trying to scare the invaders off. They're saying, hey, you guys you're not going to do anything. They know they're going to respect us. They're going to run away. But really all they did was annoy them and upset them. And so the Lapu-Lapu warriors come down, and there's a big battle on the beach, and the Europeans, weighed down by armor, they had never stood a chance. And unfortunately, with all of this, and we've talked about Magellan first to circumnavigate the world, the Lapu-Lapu knew who Magellan was. They know he's the leader. They single him out, and he's killed with a bamboo spear shoved into his chest. And so, he's surrounded, killed, and the survivors who are on the Spanish side see this. They get out of there, get to their boats, and they return back to their, allied groups and, try to lick their wounds for another day. But that's the end of Magellan, which is kind of crazy, because coming into this, I was like, he does the whole thing and he gets home and he's a hero and everything like that. But no, he dies on a Filipino island after, again, of all the things that's going to take him out, it's just really poor judgment. Again, probably a lot of arrogance, a lot of these sort of things, but this is the end of Magellan.
Yeah, it's an untimely ending, I think, across the board for him, right? And I think the part that kind of rings home for me is this is a serious miscalculation, a very serious miscalculation in what he does here. I was reading while you were talking just in my notes about this particular battle. So apparently the waters were very shallow. So him leaving his boats put them out of distance where they could provide artillery support. So he totally isolated himself and his men with, a hope and a prayer that he was going to be able to subdue them with this shock and awe approach, but it failed. And I think this is probably it is his biggest miscalculation because it cost him his life.
Absolutely. And, we talked last week a little bit about, how, when the Portuguese showed up into India, when they showed up with their trinkets and said, hey, here's some things to trade. And the locals looked at them like, what is this garbage? That's an insult to us. You can see this here. They just treat these local groups as these primitive nothing. They're going to see us as these superior beings. But again, they're part of these trade routes. They're ones who are much more sophisticated than what they should expect. And again, the strategy of just burning homes and, we burned a couple homes, they're not going to be bad. For what you can say about this group, I'm pretty sure they can count and they can know that 1,500 is a lot more than 49 people. And, you're starting to attack us. We're going to defend ourselves. But that's the end of Magellan. But the story continues and it gets crazier if you can believe it. So let's go back to, I mentioned him at the beginning, Enrique. So Enrique is this slave that Magellan had purchased when he was in Malacca last time. And Enrique was his translator, a friend, a navigator, and someone that Magellan clearly respected because he had written in his will, if I ever die, you were to be freed. And so Magellan's dead. Enrique goes, great. I'm actually kind of almost close to home. I'm free. However, the new Spaniards that take control refuse to honor his freedom. They're like, no, we still need you as a translator to get out of here. And so Enrique, we don't know exactly what happens. But next thing you know, the tribe in the Philippines that they were allied with invites them over for a feast. Sweet. These guys are our allies. We'll see what happens. Next thing you know, Spaniards are falling over on the floor, throwing up, blood coming out of their mouths, and a bunch of them have been poisoned. But Enrique has not been poisoned. Enrique lives. Now, we don't know what happens to Enrique after this. He kind of disappears from the history books. So now there's a few things that have happened. He didn't know what was going on and they spared, quote unquote, one of their own. He was in on it and he was like, you guys denied me my freedom. You're going to pay. And then the third thing is, if Enrique made it back to his home country of Malacca, which is not too far away from the Philippines, maybe he was actually technically the first person to circumnavigate the world. We don't know for sure if he did it. People like to speculate. There's no evidence that he did. But again, I kind of tease that he's kind of the Malinche factor in all of this on what was he doing during all this time. You're the translator. Who knows what he's saying? And I like the fact that he just disappears and we don't know what happens to him. I hope for his sake that he was able to live the rest of his life somewhat peacefully and free, hopefully. But I like the speculation of how involved was he with all of this.
Well, it's interesting, right? This person he was tied to and maybe only had loyalty towards is gone. He technically doesn't have to have any loyalty to any of these other men or crew members that he's been sailing with. And he's obviously been through a lot too. He's been on this entire journey, and now he has an opportunity to escape. Yeah, I don't know what to make of that story. It is very intriguing though.
Yeah, I like to think he was behind it because he was kind of wronged in this situation, but we'll never know for sure. But it's a fun one to think about, and timelines kind of line up with, if he was granted his freedom, who knows what would have happened. But now whatever's left of this ragtag group of Spaniards, Portuguese, multinational people, they got to get home. They got to figure something out because they're in big trouble, right? So João Carvalho takes command of the fleet. and orders an immediate departure. But let's remember, there were 5 ships that left. They are now at a point that they had too few men to crew the final 3 ships. So the Concepcion was burned and the 2 remaining vessels made for Brunei. And so at this point, they're desperate. They're resorting to piracy. They're sacking ships that they come across and stealing from them because they don't know what they're going to do, right? They need to bring, get stuff back, not only to get stuff back to Spain, because they're expected to show up with a bunch of spices and all these sort of things. So they can't come back empty handed. And then also they need to be able to survive. So they're able to do that. They finally get to the Spice Islands in November and they are loading up with spice cloves. They're able to purchase a bunch of things and they're sailing back across Indian Ocean. But then the one boat starts leaking. They stop the ship for repairs, but the problem is they actually land in, I believe it was Cape Verde, which is a Portuguese colony, and they were kind of like, okay, we'll be hush hush about this, we're not going to say anything. Land there, and they actually lose 13 men who are captured because the rumor is they tried to trade a spice clove, and someone was like, wait a second, how the heck did you get that? Maybe you're part of Magellan's crew. And by the time they figured out, they're able to escape and get away from Cape Verde, but they got one ship left, the Victoria, and they're able to make it back to Spain with only 18 men. So after 3 years, 5 ships, only 18 of the original 270 man crew arrive. They, were ultimately successful in finding this western passage to the Pacific, but also a failure because that's not a route that anyone's ever going to take again for trade. It's much longer. You got to cross this massive ocean, and it's not something that's going to ever be happened again. But one thing is, with one ship full of spice cloves, they were able to pay for that entire expedition and then some. So just to let you know, like how valuable spice cloves are, imagine they were able to load up all 5 and bring them back. You can see why this is worth the risk that they took. But again, this is just a sliver of who returned. 3 years they were gone, and only a small crew was able to make it back alive.
It kind of brings that back the sentiment of, was the juice worth the squeeze? 5 ships, 270 men, 3 years. What do you come back with? One ship, 18 crew members, and that ship's full of spice cloves. And it's incredible that one ship ends up justifying, at least from an economic perspective, the validity of that entire expedition or 3-year venture.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's all set up from an economic standpoint, right? But at the end of the day, we're throwing some dice to see if we can do something that humans have never done before. And I ultimately think that's the takeaway of this story, let alone all the things that happen along that way of just even being able to do all of this. But you're right. Was the juice worth the squeeze? They made money, technically. They lost a lot of good people, but ultimately they did something that had never been done before. Finally, if there was any flat earthers left out there, they've proven it that you can make it around the world. So puts that argument to bed for sure, which I'm sure was important to some people back then. But ultimately, it didn't accomplish its ultimate goal of finding that westward passage. And now the conversation of trying to find the northwest passage is the next thing of, okay, we went south. It worked, but it was kind of long. What if we go north this time? And this will start to hear a lot of stories of ships getting stuck in the ice in Canada and into Russia and things like that. Can we maybe make our way through there? And, all the struggles that come with that. But ultimately it's the creation of the Panama Canal, and that's the way to really cross around the Americas. And that wasn't built for hundreds and hundreds of years after this. So it's just an unbelievable feat of human bravery and experience and just going off into the unknown and seeing what can happen. But ultimately kind of a failure in what it was designed to do, because it didn't ultimately accomplish finding a better western route to the Spice Islands.
Yeah, I think that was the ultimate objective, right? Can we get there in a faster, more efficient way? Ultimately, I think the answer that they came to was no. There's only one quicker way to get there. But I think what this does for just like the geographic knowledge and information that it provides, and the leaps and bounds by which like human knowledge grows because of this expedition is, it can't be overstated, right? Like it's such an incredible thing. Like just thinking about the miscalculation about, we're only going to be on the Pacific Ocean for 4 or 5 days and then you're on it for 4 months. Like what that does to change, the global understanding of how big our world actually is. And I think that's the part that kind of leaves me in awe personally, because the age of exploration, I think it's such a fascinating era, but what it does to just the baseline of our human knowledge that's been kind of consistent since then, right? Like the last 500 or so years and our understanding of the globe comes from this age of exploration. Yeah, to me, it's quite an accomplishment in one way, even though, you can see it as a failure, but what it does for our understanding is incredible.
And one thing that comes out of this that you mentioned of, look at not only our geographic knowledge, but just how our world works and how the universe works and how all these things are so important. One of the most interesting things is when they come back, the ship's logbook says it's Thursday, but they arrive in Spain and they're like, it's actually Friday. And they're like, you know what? We must have messed up. It was a long journey. We must have wrote the wrong day in. But the reason was they crossed the international date line. They didn't know this thing doesn't exist, right? They've recognized that they actually, by their calculations, were one day less than what was actually going on. And this is, took them time. Eventually people started to figure out oh yeah, you did actually travel technically one day less based on the fact that you crossed this, date line that didn't exist back then. But could you imagine though, just at the time, oh yeah, we made a mistake. And then people starting to think about it going, wait a second. Or people do it again and go, no, we got the same results. And then you get this like scientific discovery and it continues on of, you get the cartographers going out there trying to map things in detail. And you get to see more people try to do these expeditions with more knowledge, and it builds and builds and it builds. And look where we are today with the ability to, send massive cargo ships across the Pacific Ocean like it's nothing. It all kind of starts from this. And I think, yeah, you said that kind of puts you in awe. And I think, the other thing is it's only 500 years. We have 500 years from Magellan's guys basically dying on the Pacific Ocean to filling up a container ship of whatever you want, and getting it here in a few weeks.
Spice cloves. Yeah.
I hope so. I hope they throw a little spice cloves on every shipment just to bring it back. Right. But yeah, I think that's probably a good way to wrap up, right? Like this is just such a cool time in history, a monumental time in history. And, like you said, it can't be understated of, how monumental this is for humanity and scientifically, economically, and it's just cool at the end of the day. So yeah.
Yeah. On top of being, I think being cool is definitely one of those parts of this particular chapter of history I enjoyed doing so much. And I think, again, like it's crucial because it does really map out our modern understanding of the world. And it hasn't changed much since then.
That's so true. Yeah. Had to start somewhere. And, you can thank Magellan and his crew for braving the unknown and making it all the way back to Spain, despite, literally limping home. They were able to do it, which I think is pretty awesome. So yeah, that wraps up our episode on Magellan, and we will be back in a couple of weeks with something else. So stay tuned for that.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the History in Motion podcast. If you enjoyed our journey through time, please subscribe, rate us, and share the podcast with friends. Your support helps keep history alive. Until next time.